The next factor in determining good pricing metrics for SaaS is expectation to pay. So expectation to pay are the psychological brakes that a customer can put on when evaluating a pricing metric that are actually distinct from the value that that pricing metric is measuring. And there are three components to expectation to pay. But before I get into the three components, I just want to make the argument that value isn't everything when trying to come up with a good pricing metric. So let me give you a few examples. Customer service in B2C. A lot of consumers will consider service a must. They will rank it highly, they would prefer it, they would enjoy it, they would value it. But to pay extra for it, usually in many circumstances, is a no-go. I know that there are luxury segments that are happy to pay for service, but by and large, service is hard to monetize in a B2C context. So it's just to show you an example of a situation where there is not a clear fit between value, demand, and the ability to monetize something. Let me give you another example. In the previous video where I talked about value and demand as a measure we can put on a pricing metric, and we used this concept of the value chain where we had a bank that was buying our solution for an AI platform, and the bank would have a value generation process or value chain that had a team that then gathered some data sources, trained some models, deployed some models, and those models generated an outcome through credit scores. The team would be seen as very fair because we provide that team with seats or user licenses, but perhaps the bank wouldn't consider it fair that we charge them based on the number of credit scores or the revenue on those credit scores, because some of those inputs very clearly aren't ours when we're delivering them the software solution. Because the idea to do models that optimize credit scores came from the bank itself. And all the data that is used to optimize those credit scores came from the bank itself. So we're just providing the platform or the tooling to run that process. But a key part of the IP and hence also the benefit and causal outcome is owned by the bank. So we can see that even though something sits at the end of a value chain and is in high demand by a customer, doesn't necessarily mean that the customer will just accept it as a pricing metric, as a mechanism to which they are priced. So this is what expectation to pay tries to measure and break down so that we can understand the dynamics and say, okay, so let's say we have 2 or 3 pricing metrics that are all at the end of the value chain. They're all sought after in high demand by the customer. But what else is at play? Are there some of them that will be more easily accepted by the customer, that will experience less friction in sales, and so forth? So that's what expectation to pay tries to measure. And if that is a weird concept for you, sometimes say, well, just substitute expectation to pay with the word fairness. Does the customer think that this is fair? Is it a fair pricing mechanism? And we can break it down. But there are 3 subcomponents. The first of which is causal connection. So causal connection basically is your solution really causally connected to produce that specific outcome that you're proposing to measure and price by? So the credit scores are a good example. You're not really, in my example, very causally connected if you just provide an AI platform to the specific outcome of a given model in that AI platform. Because the idea for that model and all the data that came into the model and the business context in which that model is used is not something that you're generating. You're just providing the tooling. Just as if you are providing, a code language, the actual code belongs to the developer, right? Because he's providing all the input of how to use it and put it together to generate a piece of software. So we can see that if you're not very causally connected to the outcome, usually there will be a lot of pushback from the customer when you propose to use this as a pricing metric. So that is criteria number 1. The second thing that we use to measure expectation to pay is cost transparency. Let's say that with this AI platform for bank, we have data sources, or we have models in deployment, or we have something else. If in some of these steps, your customer is running these models on your infrastructure, then clearly you have costs associated with running those models or ingesting all those data sources or doing the processing, whatever it might be. if you have costs associated with a metric, and it is clear to the customer that your costs go up when that metric goes up, then usually that pricing metrics will also be seen as fair when you're trying to price buy it, because it is an exchange of value. So you can say to your customer, well, whenever you use more of this, I have costs, I need to cover them, so I'm going to price you, because who else is going to pay for it? So that's the basic premise here. So if you have both things, you're saying, well, my software, for example, in this example, is helping you generate the models, and I own the models. So I have a very causal, clear connection to you being able to generate AI models. And also the models run on my cloud infrastructure. So whenever you generate models, I have costs. So now we're trying to build an argument of fairness around why pricing per model might be a good pricing metric. Okay. The third and last criteria for expectation to pay is habit. And habit simply is the user paying for this pricing metric somewhere else? So the prime example here is everyone is paying for users somewhere in their stack, right? Which is why you can price almost any software by a user-based pricing, because people are so used to paying for users that they're not even going to evaluate whether it's fair. They're not going to evaluate whether it actually is, let's say, consistent with generating the output that they want. They're just going to say, well, okay, so you price per user. I know that. I have a high degree of, let's say, competence around this. So I'm just going to consider it fair just by the face of it, because, well, I've already accepted it somewhere else. And, I don't think I'm stupid. So if I accepted it over here, I'll accept it over here as well. So habit is a very strong driver of fairness. So, which can sometimes be a trap, right? Because I worked with a customer once that did AI models for banks, and they priced per user because the customers were willing to accept it as fair. But the problem was that the customer didn't have any demand for users, because users were at the very beginning of the value chain. So they were seen as a cost input. So the bank would just buy as few users as possible, then put them into the value chain, have the users build models and generate value and output and so forth. And then at the end, they would come back and maybe buy some more users, but they would receive no pushback on this. So really what we need to do with a good pricing metric is to, once we have established that there is demand and value for it, we need to run it by these friction criteria in the expectation to pay concept, or the fairness concept, and say, well, if there's demand, are there also going to be pushback? Is there going to be friction? Will I be able to make the argument that this is a good pricing metric to the customer outside of the clear argument that they actually want this? So can I argue that we have a causal connection to this, that we're actually generating this outcome for you? It's not something that you partly generate. Two, do we have clear costs associated with this? So we actually have some skin in the game, and we need you to pay for this to cover those costs. And three, are you already paying for this somewhere else? Is it a habit, something that is normal for you to pay by? If these three things are in place, then you probably have a strong pricing metric from an expectation to pay standpoint. And if it's also valuable and it's also, first video, operationally viable, then you're probably, closing in on something that is a solid mechanism for you to use as the core metric in your pricing. This actually only leaves us with the last of the 4 videos, which is the next one, which is on metric density. And that has to do with whether each of the units you're pricing by, users, models, API calls, whatever it is, has the same size. So if one model is tiny and generates only a little value, and another model is huge and generates a bunch of value, coming up with one individual price for these can be hard. But we cover that in the next video on metric density. So stay tuned for that. All right, cheers.